this?
Yeah.
We might have to use a link for the live stream,
Oh, okay.
so we might just have to do that again. Because the audio is weird, but either way, we'll get it recorded so we can send it out.
You can always like send it out in a tweet as well.
So you guys say when you're ready.
Yeah, we're setting up finishing the live stream. And
Okay.
So I'm just gonna tap.
Yes.
Yeah, once you turn it on.
Test. There's a new link.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, there it is.
Can you tweet it?
Yeah. No, the old link doesn't.
Oh,
But
yeah,
we are on this right now, so be careful what you say.
Oh, then can you send the new link?
Yeah, I'll send it out an email and I'll tweet it out too.
Sweet. Send it to my parents. Yeah, my dad's in the old link right now.
Is it the link is working?
Yes.
I'll get my phone.
I still have my makeup on. I didn't have enough time to take off my makeup. Maybe you should do it every day. Little mascara, you know. At our age, I'll take any day. That was a funny thing. So the producer of the show in CNN is actually an Emory alum who grew up in the same sorority as Victoria. She knows Victoria very well. No. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's pretty cool. So I was talking to her. I mean, she's in New York, but I was talking to her through the microphone and said, "Oh, I know Victoria really well." I said, "Really?" Well, Jean was she did a grand round for a beat, and she sent me some slides. So they said, "We take any help we can." Yeah. So some of the slides came from Jeanette. So I just put a bunch of slides together to redo everything from some of the slides came from you, Tech, Yeah. COVID-19 is technically the disease. The SARS-CoV-2 is technically the virus. SARS-CoV-2, but I hate calling it SARS-CoV-2. It creates a lot of confusion with SARS. Exactly. I just had this everyone. Yeah. So we still call it SARS. SARS to me means 30% mortality. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead and do it. Go for it. Well, so you have a map. Okay. Sounds good. Okay. No, not really. We'll answer questions that they have. Yeah. You just want to give like a general survey of everything, and then just give like 30 minutes. Yeah, just yeah. How are they doing step one? No, it's 2 years now. Oh wow. This increase is having people money. 542. That's insane. That is insane. How many? 542. 540 what? 542. Ready?
Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So if you're signing in and grabbing pizza, finish up doing that at any time. If there's pizza left, go ahead and grab it. Thank you guys so much for coming today. We are the infectious disease interest group. Yeah, and today we have the great opportunity to hear from Dr. Carlos Del Rio and Dr. Anish Mehta on the coronavirus outbreak. We're going to get some updates. They're going to give us a background on kind of the viral structure all the way through the epidemiology. Charlie sent out the live stream in the group me. So if you know people that want to watch it, it's a new link now. And then, yeah, so we're going to have about a 20 to 30 minute presentation, and then feel free to ask any questions at all. And if you haven't signed in, just make sure you sign in at the end. The ID interest group is kind of new, so we want to make sure we can keep doing stuff like this. Awesome. Thanks so much.
hear us? Can everybody hear?
Can you hear us okay? Great.
Okay, so really happy to be with you. My name is Carlos Del Rio. I'm a professor of medicine and global health here at Emory. I'm in the School of Medicine down at Grady and also in the School of Public Health. And I've been doing ID for many years. I finished my fellowship in 1988, and I've been involved in. Part of the reasons I got into ID was an outbreak, was a disease called HIV. I came to Emory initially because I wanted to be a cardiologist. There was a very famous cardiologist here, J. Willis Hurst, and I came here because I wanted to be a cardiologist. But this was 1983 when I started my internship, and HIV was beginning, and it was really that epidemic, that early disease that just fascinated me. I mean, people my age were getting sick, they were dying, the immune system was being destroyed. We're seeing all sorts of interesting infections, and I think I've dedicated myself to HIV and to infectious disease because it was an epidemic that sort of got me into this. And since then, while I mostly do HIV in my research and in my, I'm really interested in sort of epidemics as a result of that. And I was involved, very involved in the pandemic of influenza in 2009. And I always find pandemics fascinating because they allow you to really, it's almost like riding going down a sort of rapids in a canoe, right? Everything is moving in different directions. You really don't know what's going to happen. There's new information coming in different ways. And I think you need to be as sort of trying to steer the boat as much as you can, trying to gather information, trying to understand information. I think what makes this epidemic right now really, to me, fascinating is I really think this is the first epidemic of the social media era. And I think we're sharing a lot of information through social media. And I think there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of fake information, a lot of disinformation. And I think we have a special role in trying to make sure that information actually stays real. And I'll give you an example of that. The article of this epidemic with the highest altmetric scores. People know what's altmetric score? Altmetric score is a measure of the impact of an article based on how much they're covered by media and how much they're covered in social media. The altmetric score of the highest article with the highest altmetric score is an article that said that this virus was very similar to HIV. It has since been discredited. It's actually been removed, but it's still the article most quoted by the news and most talked about, which is totally fake news. So I think we have a really big obligation to provide credible information continuously about this infection to avoid fake news, to avoid misinformation. And that's why I'm happy to be talking to you. And I was happy to be on CNN this morning, and I'm happy to talk to somebody else later, because the reality is the more we repeat the information, the more we share correct information, the better we're going to be. I mean, we're going to be all prepared for this epidemic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anish Mehta. I am also an infectious disease doctor here at Emory University. Unlike Carlos, I actually came to Emory and went into infectious disease to be an HIV physician. And also,
but you went to college here.
Yeah, that's right. I was an undergrad here, and I've been here. So I first came here in 1995. So I've seen a lot of growth and wonderful changes here at Emory. And I should also say I've been mentored by Carlos Del Rio for over 13 years now. So one of the great things that we see here at Emory is these phenomenal mentors who stay with you for the rest of your life. So I came here, I wanted to do HIV medicine, still love taking care of patients with HIV. But on the wards, I came across some cancer patients that had these really interesting viral infections that I had never seen before. And it got me very interested in the interface between viruses and the immune system and some of the things that we do to patients and how that leads to infectious diseases. And so then I went down this route of doing viral immunology research, and then went into the field of transplant and oncology infectious disease, which is where I spend most of my time. I also had the honor of being a member of the Emory Serious Communicable Diseases Unit, which is our biocontainment unit at Emory University Hospital, and got to take care of patients with Ebola in 2014 and 15, patients with Lassa fever. And one of the things that I think that came out of that experience, and also the experience in 2009 with H1N1, is how impactful these new diseases or re-emerging diseases can be on our healthcare systems, but also importantly, how important these outbreaks can be to the sort of their social impact on communities around the world. And right now, what we're seeing, and Carlos and I were talking about this morning, is beyond the medical and health impact that this new coronavirus is having, it's really having dramatic impact on populations within China and Chinese populations across the world that we also need to consider and think about. And that's why I think we like being out here talking about it, so that we really sort of bring all the hysteria down and really think about it on a real world level and how we're adequately trying to take care of this and take care of the people that are most afflicted by this disease.
Okay, so we're going to talk very quickly in about 30 minutes. We'll talk about this, run through some slides and some information, and then we'll just open it up for questions. So why is it called, go back one slide, why is it called COVID-19? So COVID-19 means coronavirus infectious disease of 2019. That's the name of the syndrome. That's like saying AIDS or influenza. And now SARS-CoV-2 of 2019 is the name of the virus. And it's really confusing. So some people call it the SARS virus, but the SARS virus is actually a different virus. So I'm not too happy with that name yet. Next one. So this is what I'm going to try to cover. Next one. So this is the virus we're talking about. They're called coronaviruses. And people know what corona means? Corona comes from the Latin, right? Meaning crown. And what happens is this virus has a crown around it. It's an RNA virus. And it's named for this sort of solar crown appearance in the virions. And you can see it has a protein, and the spike glycoprotein S in the surface. And that glycoprotein is really important because that's the protein that the virus uses to attach to respiratory cells. And in fact, we know that this virus attaches to the ACE receptor, the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor. And maybe anybody knows what the angiotensin converting enzyme is, or what does it do?
How do we use it in medicine now?
It's really important for control of blood pressure. And in fact, there's medications we have like lisinopril that actually are blockers of the angiotensin converting enzyme. So this is actually a really important enzyme in the regulation of your blood pressure. So it's interesting that the virus attaches to that. And obviously that gives us some ideas of the kind of treatments we can use in the future, right? There's other parts of the virus that are very important, but this is also a fairly large virus. This is for an RNA virus, actually a fairly large virus. Coronaviruses are a big family of viruses. They cause about 10 to 30% of colds. Regular colds, many of them are caused by coronavirus, but not this kind of coronaviruses. And they replicate at lower temperatures. And that's why you've heard people say, well, when it's summer, they'll go away, because they don't do very well with high temperature. And then this corona is important because it helps them survive in the GI tract. And therefore, you can actually find them in stool, for example. And they're really difficult to transmit. Transmission control, I mean, you've seen how it's not easy to get rid of a cold, right? Because a cold starts passing around with people. So they're really hard to control.
Right. And this, we'll talk about more of this later, because they're passed not only through droplets, but they can live on surfaces for extended periods of time. And then we can pick them up and expose ourselves through our mucous membranes.
So this is just a phylogenetic tree, and I just show it just because here you'll hear talk about alpha coronaviruses, you'll hear talk about the beta coronaviruses, etc. Here's, for example, is the MERS coronaviruses here. But you will see, I showed this because you'll see a lot of them says bad COVID, bad COVID, bad COVID. So a lot of these viruses live in bats, and we're going to talk about that later. That's kind of talks about the role of bats in this disease.
So this just highlights the point that there are a lot of coronaviruses out there in nature, and every once in a while they are able to cross into other species and then eventually cross into
and you
humans.
can see the SARS coronavirus is there, the MERS one is there, so there are
right, and the COVID-19 or SARS
right there.
Right, what falls right in there.
Yeah. Okay, so what's the scoop with bats? I mean, who likes bats here? Bats are really cool. Why are bats cool? Well, but they're really agriculture. They're really important to control insects. They're really important in pollination of plants. But actually, I had no idea. Bats actually are 20% of all mammals in the world. They're actually one of the most prevalent species. And they live a long time. They live about 40 years. They fly a long distance, which means they can take infections in different places. They actually have evolved to tolerate more viruses than any other mammal. And have therefore a significant for carrying infections. And And the bats actually have suppressed their immune system in such a way that they don't get sick from viruses. In fact, a branch of the immune system that you'll hear about later, called the innate immunity, the immune system is divided into adaptive and innate immunity. Their innate immunity is actually different from, it's kind of suppressed. So a virus comes in and doesn't really do anything to them, but they're able to transmit the infection. And there's actually more than 500 coronaviruses in China related to bats. So we all think that China, therefore, is a big emerging site for bat-related coronaviruses. And SARS is an example, and this new infection is another example. So if you're going to predict where a coronavirus from bats is going to come as a new infection, China is likely the place because there are a lot of them there. And they usually take an intermediate host to pass it to humans. It's not the bat. Bats, if a bat bites you, what disease are you at risk of getting? Rabies. But here, a bat, for example, Ebola, the bat doesn't bite you, right?
Right.
How do you get Ebola?
So there's some intermediate host or exposure that you get, or you come across a dead bat and you try to get rid of it, and then you get exposed to its blood, and then you can pick up Ebola virus, Marburg virus, other viruses like that. So that's a really important point about these viruses in bats, because humans actually don't come in contact with bats all that often, but they are the reservoir for several different species of viruses, and it's really through their interactions with other wildlife and sometimes domesticated animals that those viruses then get exposed to human beings. And as we have changes in our climate, the distribution of bats change. As we have more deforestation, we have more urbanization, some of these environments are becoming more compressed, so those interactions between those different species, which used to be more rare, become more common, and therefore the risk to human populations can go up because of that.
So tell me, bonus question. Tell me one infection that is not viral and is linked to bats. So disease called, it's a fungal infection. Histoplasma, yeah, very good. And it lives in the bat guano. So if you go into a case full of bats, you're at risk of this. And I say this because we're going to talk later on about how one of the things we love in infectious disease is take a very detailed history. And somebody with a pneumonia who's been in a cave with bats, you think about it very different than somebody who's been in China. They both may come in with pneumonia, but they're very different pneumonias, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is just to show you, this is a cool article. I'm not going to go into details, but it really is a really cool article by Peter Daszak and his group, just showing how this predicted the spillover from animals. And again, here are the bats. You will see them somewhere in here. I thought they were here, but they're not. But this graph, yeah, there they are. And you can see how many of how rich they are in viruses they can transmit. And it just talks about how this intersection and this interaction. And when we think nowadays of emerging infections, we always think about zoonotic infections. They come from animals somehow. And what Anish said is because we interact with them, is because we change the environment, is because climate change, it's because all these things we're doing that is dramatically changing our interactions with our ecosystem. So this is a great story. So SARS was the first of this kind of family of coronaviruses. This emerged in 2002. And it emerged in a city called Guangzhou in the Guangdong province of China. And we didn't hear much about it, actually. But then there was a physician who had treated a SARS patient at a teaching hospital in Guangzhou who traveled to Hong Kong and spent time at a hotel called Hotel M. We know it's a Metropole Hotel, but in the articles it appears as Hotel M. And there was a huge transmission, and Anish will talk later about super spreaders. This person infected a bunch of people in the hotel. They never saw each other, but they were maybe in the same floor, they were in the same elevator. Nobody really knows how they infected each other. But who has seen the movie Contagion? Remember in Contagion, you touch something and then you touch your mucous membranes? That comes from SARS. That's from how people thought that it happened at the Metropole. But then from the Metropole, people went all over the world, and this made the infection become global. One of the people that was actually at the Hotel Metropole went to Thailand, and it was taken care of by a physician. WHO sent a physician because they thought this was a case of influenza. Nobody knew what this was. And this physician, this epidemiologist called Carlo Urbani, went, took care of this patient, tried to understand what's going on. But then he got infected. And he got infected and eventually died. And before he died, autopsies are very rare, almost not done. But Carlo Urbani requested that his lungs be removed and that his lungs be sent to different agencies around the world to try to figure what he had. So he had an autopsy by request. He consented to his autopsy before he died. And the lungs were sent to multiple places, including to the CDC. And it was here at the CDC when they got the lung of Dr. Urbani that they were able to do electron microscopy. And through electron microscopy, they were able to identify the virus. And then they published a paper. And if you look at the paper, it actually has Dr. Urbani as one of the co-authors, even though he was dead by that time because it was his request. But by the time, it took about almost 6 months to identify this virus. Now it took us, what, 6 weeks or 4 weeks?
Yeah, less than that even to
So-
sequence the virus.
So it shows how the molecular techniques have dramatically increased. But SARS was really scary. SARS caused about, I will show you in the next slide, but it's caused about 8,000 cases and about 700 deaths. The mortality was about 10%. A lot of transmission in hospitals. Now, in this SARS coronavirus, again, bats, but there was an intermediate host, and the intermediate host was an animal called the civet cat that you can see up there that was used for soups and all sorts of things. So again, related to things that you eat, and markets have a very important role in these infections.
Yeah, and this was related to some cultural changes as well. So civet cats had been part of interaction in that part of China for a long time, but there was this growing culture to use them in different ways, and therefore they were being caged and bred. And so you saw a lot of sort of aggregation of these cats that had never been seen before. And we think that's a big part of how the epi of this virus first started. Also, I'll tell you, I was a fourth-year medical student when this started happening. And I remember sort of like in the spring of 2003, anyone who came into the emergency room with any sort of upper respiratory disease, we were all like, oh my God, do they have SARS? And of course, almost none of them, or none of them had SARS.
None of them.
That I saw.
We did not see a case here in
Right,
Atlanta.
Exactly. I remember being in the blue zone down at Grady as an intern, and someone came in and they were afraid of SARS, and like the whole place cleared out very quickly. Patients suddenly started going away. So it was a very interesting night that night. Okay.
So just here are the numbers. And again, just look at the spread. And why do you think it spread so much? Because air travel, right?
Yeah.
Because you can be in Hong Kong and the next night you can be in Toronto. The next night you can be in New York. And I think we don't realize how much air travel contributes to the spread of infectious disease. But the reality is there's a great advantage to globalization. There's a great disadvantage. You can no longer keep diseases away.
And this is 2002. And so air travel and other mechanisms of travel have greatly increased. And also in many areas of the world where travel was restricted for individuals due to authoritative rule, now they have been more liberalized. And so there's far more travel from all corners of the world than we've ever had before.
But look at this, the case fatality, almost 10%. And that's when you hear something like SARS, it's scary. 10% mortality, it's really high.
And when it was first happening, we thought maybe up to 35% mortality, which is what caused a lot of panic that went throughout the world. So most of these patients with SARS have an incubation period that we now know of 2 to 14 days, and that's pretty true for most coronaviruses. The patients that got sick enough to be admitted to the hospital were usually about 3 to 5 days into their symptoms before they got sick enough for that needing hospitalization. But very interestingly, and this is again a problem with our current coronavirus, is a problem with other novel infections that we get, they all sort of start out indistinguishable from each other. They start out with typical viral-like syndromes. So fevers, body aches, chills, decreased appetite.
Well, in fact, if you saw somebody with those symptoms, what would you think about?
Yeah.
Flu, right?
Exactly.
I mean, so you can have the flu, right? It looks exactly the same. And in fact, the current coronavirus, that slide, you can change it and say current coronavirus, the symptoms are the same.
Yeah. So they all start out the same way. In fact, even Ebola can start out with fevers, chills, rigors, headaches, malaise, fatigue. So often these viral syndromes start out the same way. And why we'll get into why taking a good history.
I hear that's how you feel after you take step 1, actually.
Yeah. Hopefully a little less when it's just pass fail, so which I'm super excited about. So when we talk about transmission within hospitals, this is something. So one of the things that I do is I'm a faculty member of the National Emerging Infections Training and Education Center. which is based here at Emory and University of Nebraska and NYU. We've been going around the country trying to train hospital systems, healthcare systems, public health systems to be prepared for these sort of novel infections because of this primarily. So what we learned from SARS is that when patients are in close proximity to each other, these respiratory secretions make it much more likely for them to be spread in communities. But then when we put them in healthcare systems where they're tightly compacted and they're having very intimate interactions with several people, healthcare workers in particular, the chance of transmission goes up dramatically. And so in this outbreak, healthcare workers accounted for up to 40% of the cases that we were seeing. And one index patient that we'll talk about can spread this virus to several healthcare workers that then spread it to several other of their colleagues and patients and also take it home with them. So this is why having infection control measures have a protocol that we call identify, isolate, and inform is critical at all of our healthcare settings. And we'll talk more about that.
But again, this is when you start going on the wards and you're going to go see somebody who has a respiratory infection. You got to put a mask, and you're going to put an N95 mask, and you're going to have to be fitted for an N95. And it's kind of like sometimes you say, oh my, this bureaucratic BS, but the reality is not. It's really like putting on if you were a fireman and you would have to get fitted with your helmet and all your stuff you need. This is part of what you need to protect yourself.
So this is more of just what we were talking about, these effective, what really stopped SARS.
We did not have a vaccine.
Right.
We did not have treatment. But what stopped it?
Is good infection control and good public health. So we figured out how to identify these patients early, get them appropriately isolated. And then our public health colleagues went out there, did contact tracing, finding everybody who'd been in contact with confirmed cases, monitored them, making sure that we minimized their opportunities to spread it within those communities, and this virus started to go away. So yeah, this is a great number. So over 30,000 people had contact tracing and quarantine in 2003 in just one city of Beijing.
Now the number is 10 times that.
Right.
So MERS, just very quickly, MERS was another coronavirus. So 2002 was SARS, 2012 is MERS, 2019 is this new coronavirus. And that's why Dr. Fauci wrote a paper in JAMA says, another decade, another coronavirus, because it seems like every decade we get a new one. This started in Saudi Arabia. The people develop severe pneumonia. They also develop respiratory failure. Here, the mortality is 34%. But there haven't been that many cases. Go to the next slide. And there haven't been that many cases because of an interesting thing. Well, one of them, again, bats. Remember bats? Here, the intermediate host is this guy over here, the dromedary. Anybody who's been around camels or dromedaries? They spit. They really have a lot of respiratory secretions. I remember being in Saudi Arabia when this was going on and it was being investigated, and we said, do you guys have bats? And they said, no, we don't have bats. And then sort of the dawn started, and you can see bats all over the place, right? So obviously the bats, the dromedaries, the humans, that's how the contact starts. But look how this disease spread. Go to the next one. Go back. A disease spread because of travel, right? Travel from Jeddah to here, travel from here to here. It's all travel. But we'll talk later about what's called the reproductive number of an infection. This has a very low reproductive number. In other words, it doesn't have sustained human-to-human transmission. So you travel and you get sick, and then it disappears, except
in a healthcare setting. So this is, again, a prototypic example of why we're going out there and teaching all healthcare personnel, all healthcare systems, why it's really important to identify, isolate, and inform. So this is a intense story. So there is how MERS-CoV ended up in Seoul, Korea. So there was this patient who had been in the Middle East for business travel. And he came back and he visited a couple of different medical centers with an upper respiratory infection. And finally was diagnosed at Samsung Hospital, which is a phenomenal hospital in Seoul. He later it was discovered that he infected 28 other individuals prior because he had moved on to a couple different centers. However, this patient 14 had come to Samsung Hospital for completely unrelated reasons. and ended up becoming exposed to this patient. And he ended up spreading this virus to several other people. And this is just a schematic of their emergency room. But this is patient number 1. And during his stay at Samsung, he infected, unfortunately, several other people in that hospital. Patient 14, probably due to the severity of his illness and his social network and the time he spent in the hospital, and importantly, because by this time they were starting to do screening for travel, but he had never left Korea. His only exposure was in that hospital to this person who had traveled.
And he probably didn't know he'd been exposed to that person.
He had no idea, right? So he ended up spreading it to 76 other people who spread it to hundreds of other people, or dozens of other people, I should say. So this is why healthcare settings are incubators for these sort of outbreaks, and why we have to be really careful about how we approach these patients to make sure that we're getting great history, finding out the epidemiology of their syndrome, and making sure that we take the appropriate measures, not only to take care of them, but protect our colleagues and protect our communities.
And actually, wash your hands.
Yeah.
As something as simple as in healthcare settings. You see a patient, you wash your hands. You're about to go see a patient, you wash your hands. There's never too much hand washing. Nobody's going to say ever to you in the wars, you're washing your hands a little too much.
Yeah.
They may say you're washing your hands a little too little. And that we will tell you over and over. But a little too much, I've never heard anybody say that.
Yeah, exactly. I begin and end every lecture with wash your hands. Okay, so, and the impact that this had on the community was staggering. So it significantly cut the growth, economic growth of Korea. It's shut down Samsung Hospital, which was their premier, and it still is their premier quaternary care hospital. Hundreds of schools closed for weeks on end. And at the end, just tourism, they lost $14 billion in 2013 dollars. So much more greater impact now.
So we in healthcare don't really talk much about this, but the biggest impact, the biggest problem with an epidemic, with a pandemic, is actually the economic impact to a nation. The economic impact to the world. Quite frankly, I really think the world economy, if this is not stopped soon, it's going to go into recession because, China is such an important component of the economy. So this is why governments need to care about epidemics. I can tell you in 2009, when the outbreak of pandemic flu started, and started in Mexico, I was a Thursday evening, I was getting ready to go to bed, and a friend of mine who called me, and this friend at that point was the Secretary of Finance in Mexico, and he calls me about 10 o'clock at night. He says, I'm on the way to the president's house. They're calling for emergency meeting because they think there's an epidemic of swine flu. And he's an economist, a PhD economist trained in Chicago. And he says, tell me everything I need to know about pandemic, about swine flu between now and the next 30 minutes. I said, oh, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know. You need to call tomorrow the FMA, the International Monetary Fund, and you need to ask for a line of credit because this is going to hurt your economy. It's going to give you probably a 0.5 to 1% drop in GDP. And he says, you got to be kidding. He never thought about that, right? You always think about the health consequences, but the economic consequences are huge. Countries' tourism shuts down. I mean, think about the airlines right now. There's nobody traveling. You want to go to China? Wait a couple of months. They're going to be great deals. Because hotels, I mean, after 2009 pandemic flu, I mean, literally, hotels in Cancun were giving out rooms for free so people would travel down there. Hotel industry went bankrupt in Mexico, the air travel industry. So the economic consequences to a country of a pandemic are huge, and that's why frequently countries are unwilling to report a pandemic, right? Because they say, oh my God, if I report, I mean, SARS, what was going to happen right as SARS was happening in China? Next year, what was happening? The Olympics. They were really concerned about this impact in the Olympics. So countries frequently are not willing to let this out because they're concerned about the economic consequences.
And I'll just point out, too, this is a huge economic consequence. 2009 H1N1 had a huge economic consequence to Mexico, even though the outbreak actually started in the United States. But the impact was primarily in Mexico. But I'll say, influenza every year has a significant impact on our economy during that time, with children being out of school, our coworkers being out of work. We see a lot of slowdown. And so all the things that we do and we teach about and the care that we deliver, if we can diminish the spread of all of these things together, we can enable our economies to work better. We can enable people to work more.
So when
and
your friends
provide-
say, when you're washing your hands, you're getting vaccinated for influenza, when somebody says, what are you doing? You say, I'm boosting the stock market.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm investing in boosting the stock market. That's what you're doing. Because by not being sick, you're helping the economy.
We should make a
t-shirt,
badge
right?
or something with that. Yeah, I like it.
Okay, so let's go on to COVID-19. Next one. Okay, so who knew Wuhan? Okay, you knew. I had never heard about Wuhan, okay? Until this started. The first thing I had to do is get a map and say, where is this? Well, it turns out that Wuhan is the capital of Hubei province. It is is the 7th largest city of China. It's 11 million people. It has major universities, major healthcare facilities. I mean, this is people, actually, one of the techs that works in the Hope Clinic lab is from Wuhan. And she was telling me the way the Chinese think about Wuhan is they say this is the Chicago of China. Is this city in the center of the country that is a very important transportation and economic hub. So think about this happening in Chicago in order to understand the impact that this has. And it started there in like the early December. By mid-December, they really figured something was going on. But it wasn't until December 31st that WHO China's office was notified. And then you've seen what has happened since then. We talked about the name of the disease, the name of the virus. And as of now, there's over 71,000 confirmed cases and about almost 1,800 deaths. I mean, of which 98% are in mainland China and 79% are in Hubei province. Why is it so contained to mainland China and Hubei province? Because everything that has been done to contain it, right? Right now, we're in the containment phase. Later, we'll talk about in an epidemic after containment. When you cannot contain it, you have to go to a mitigation phase. We're still trying to contain it. We're trying to make sure, and Chinese have done an incredible job of closing cities, limiting travel, trying to keep it there. And I think it's pretty darn good because it really hasn't gone in many other places, except for one place, right?
Yeah.
We'll talk about it.
We'll talk about the ship.
Okay.
So Carlos and I, we updated these numbers like 6 a.m. this morning. These numbers have already jumped in just the few hours since then.
And I think that's a really important number down here.
Yeah. So 1,700 healthcare workers so far infected. These are frontline workers, and now we're seeing, particularly in Hubei, secondary workers. So people in the hospital have become infected.
The director, actually, of a neurosurgeon who's the director of the major hospital in Wuhan just died this morning.
And a lot of the physicians that were starting to report these novel syndrome that they were seeing, many of them died as well. So I think that needs to be why sort of all the things we're talking about is so important, because they not only the things that we put in place to protect us against outbreaks protect our patients, they protect ourselves, and they protect our community.
So to one quick word, all these pictures are from Wuhan. They're real. You see everybody wearing a face mask. We can talk about later about face masks in more detail, but not useful. Okay.
and this is a common scene throughout Asia right now. Supermarkets completely out of food. One, shipping has stopped, transportation has stopped, and everybody who had the means to do so went and brought weeks of provisions for themselves. So that also creates disparity in the community. So I have family that live in Singapore and family that travel to China a lot. So if you have means, you're able to do this. But those who have limited means and can only buy 3 days worth of groceries at a time, now they have no option to get food. And there's food insecurity going on, which then allows for infectious diseases to spread even more rapidly.
I just show this because there's some pictures that a student who graduated from Rollins here, she's married to the Australian consulate there, and he's the Australian consulate in Singapore, but he was sent to Wuhan to evacuate Australian citizens from that city. And so she sent me these pictures. And again, you can see he's over here and all the different people and what they're doing, but they're basically taking temperatures in everybody, doing all syndromic. I mean, they're really trying to prevent anybody with disease to get outside of Wuhan. Okay, so this is a famous number. We'll spend a little time here. This is called the R naught. You can see the R with a little ball at the bottom. That's why it's called R naught. But it's called the reproductive index. And what that means, the worst disease you can think about is measles. It's 18. Means one person has measles, 18 people get it. It's really contagious. On this other end of the spectrum is something like hepatitis C, right? Or Ebola. Ebola, we're concerned about Ebola, but Ebola is only about 3, right? One person could infect 3. Okay, go to the next one. Well, this is a really nice graph from the New York Times. So here you have in the bottom, you have the number of infected people. Here you have severity, right? Mortality. So spreads faster that way, kills more people that way. So you can see measles, very, very high R naught, but not a high mortality, right? You can see over here MERS. MERS has a very low R naught, less than 1. So it doesn't transmit human to human very effectively, but a high mortality, about 50%. Where is this virus today? It's somewhere in that yellow, in that pink box, somewhere in there. You'll see different people calculating the number. We still don't know the real number, but it's somewhere in the middle of that. So it is kind of similar to swine flu. It's a little bit less than SARS. It's about the same as the Spanish flu. What was the Spanish flu? The 1918 famous pandemic, the mother of all pandemics. That epidemic with an R naught. When people say, well, it's not very infectious, it's only about 2, just like the Spanish flu. Well, the Spanish flu was only 2 and only had a mortality of about 8 to 10%. It killed 3% of the world population. It killed 50 to 100 million people in 1918. So this is really concerning. Imagine if this virus spread like that. It will kill 3% of the world population, will be huge. So that's why when people say to me, what scares you? When I hear about pandemic, it's a repeat of the Spanish flu of 1918. I mean, that would be truly, and that's when every time we worry about pandemics, that's the one we think about like the worst possible pandemic. It's like the nuclear bomb of pandemics.
Interesting note, the Spanish flu probably didn't start in Spain. So this is one of the things that we often do in medicine is we accidentally create stigma. And so by calling it the Spanish flu, we stigmatize Spaniards. And so now, actually, we were debating this on Twitter the other day, which is something that I'm just learning from Dr. Del Rio. But how do we name things now, right? And so this is how we got to COVID-19, is because when
not very sexy, right?
It's not sexy. It's sort of very bland and generic because the WHO really wanted to avoid stigmatizing any particular area of the world.
Many of us wanted to call it Wuhan pneumonia.
Yeah, that's
but
what
that would have been bad.
That's what I would have voted for. But because for us as infectious disease doctors, thinking about the epi and the region and the transmission, if you can put it all in the name, it makes it so much easier to remember. So, but yes, we do want to avoid stigma in the things that we do.
In fact, something really interesting that I didn't hear. Who's heard this podcast might kill you? It's really good, right? So we did one of those with Aaron, and I heard in that podcast something that I didn't know about SARS. And I didn't know SARS was very stigmatizing because SARS actually is semi-autonomous region is the word used for Hong Kong. So a lot of people are saying that the name was chosen because it resembles Hong Kong. Because remember I told you about Metropole M, and it was in Hong Kong. A lot of cases came out of Hong Kong. So a lot of people in Hong Kong were very upset when the name was called SARS, which really means severe acute respiratory syndrome. But really, they thought it was semi-autonomous region.
So this is the data.
So if you're going to go one place, go there, okay? Yeah. Okay, every morning when I wake up, I click in this thing. It's like my morning routine is clicking that thing. It's really cool place.
It is.
It gives you the data, real time. You can see what's going on. You can see what countries have disease. So for example, if I click on the Princess Cruise, it takes you right here, right? It tells you exactly where they are. And in fact, I can click here in Wuhan, and it tells me Hubei province. Here's the number of confirmed cases, deaths, and covered. I can move to the United States, and I can say, oh, what's going on in the United States? Here are the cases. So here's a case that just made it to Nebraska. And there's a case, there are 14 cases in Nebraska with 0 deaths and 0 recovered. Huh? So you can actually move around the world and see exactly where the cases are. It can show you the graph. So very good, cool site. Go here.
Okay. So we're gonna move along. So one thing that Carlos and I did though is we calculated this just while we were sitting here. So the Diamond Princess cruise ship by itself has more cases than all the countries except for China combined, in that one cruise ship.
So I used to love going to cruise ships. No more.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're gonna quickly just talk about the virus, and then we're gonna open it up for questions. Okay. So the incubation is about 5 days on average, but 2 to 14 days is what we say is the overall incubation period. I think most of the data actually supports that. Patients present, again, with very vague symptoms: fevers, dry cough, myalgias, and fatigue. They often
Well, we know you guys are really early in your medical training, but if you saw that X-ray, what would you say? Oh shit, right? I mean, that's really bad, right? That's really bad. Okay, whenever you see that, that's really bad.
see once you're a professor of medicine, then you can start saying things like that. And so, okay. So the actually really important point, the vast majority of these cases are mild, even in China. 80% are mild. Outside of China, it's closer to 90% of the cases are mild.
So you guys ever heard about the HIV iceberg? You never heard about the iceberg? Okay, so early in the HIV epidemic, we were seeing all these people die of HIV, right? But eventually we figured out that those were just the people that were up here. Below the iceberg, there were a bunch of people who were infected and didn't have any symptoms. This is very similar, right?
Yeah, we'll probably find thousands and thousands of cases that were so mild they weren't initially picked up. So this will actually probably grow as a number. Those people who do get sick, generally very sick, get sick in their second week of illness. And about 30% need intensive care. Acute lung injury and respiratory distress syndrome develop in almost 30%. And mechanical ventilation has been used in up to 10% of patients. So they do get very sick if they don't clear it right away.
So just a quick summary. You can have the slide, look at it. The three viruses, you can see the bat, then the civet, the bat, and the camel. And in this virus, everybody's saying, which is the agent? And people have said snakes, and people have said this and the other. And the winner appears to be this little creature over here.
Does anyone know what this is?
This is called a pangolin. Who's ever heard about a pangolin? Okay. Well, you know that I had no idea what a pangolin was, and I've been learning about pangolins. And what do you know about pangolins? They're actually the most illegally traded species in the world. And they're very valued in China for food and for medicine. And actually, a colleague of us who's from Cameroon, BK, she says that in Cameroon, they have essentially, taken away all the pangolins.
Yeah. So this is, again, a cultural change that has occurred. It may or may not be linked to this outbreak, but I think it's highly suspicious. The penguin trade, the amount of concentration and breeding of these animals that occur, and all the different uses of this animal may be linked to the spread of this virus. Okay, so we'll just say there's no known therapeutic yet or vaccine, but there is a phase 1 trial coming very soon of an mRNA vaccine that you'll learn about these different vaccine techniques that are being used. So as you guys know, there are lots of travel advisories that have gone on. And at the end of January, we announced in the United States a significant restriction of travel to and from China. And as you guys recently heard, we've evacuated hundreds and hundreds of people from Wuhan, and then more recently, the Diamond Princess cruise ship. I'm just going to quickly, I don't want you guys to know these details, but this is why we as infectious disease doctors spend so much time asking questions, because it's those precise epidemiologic clues that hone you into the diagnosis that you make. And so this is why we've created these specific criteria to help us assess the risk of a patient. But you can only do that if you ask the right questions, you write the right questions up front. Skip this for now.
Well, let's just go back to that one for a second. You know this difference? Isolation and quarantine? Your families may ask you. So just know the difference.
Yeah.
What's isolation? You take somebody sick and you put them in a place so they don't transmit. What's quarantine? You take healthy people and you keep them in a place to make sure they don't have an infection, and you keep them in there as long. What does the name quarantine come from? Because it used to be 40. It used to be 40 days that you kept people in isolation for many diseases. When we didn't know the incubation, you would keep people 40 days locked up until you were absolutely sure they didn't have a disease. And this comes from the times of smallpox, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's an important thing that gets used interchangeably, but medically we should use these things distinguished. And speaking of the podcast that we did, Aaron and Aaron have a drink called the Quarantini. You should try it. So again, we talked about this all throughout, but it's critical that every one of us, whether you're a medical student, you're a resident, you're an attending, you're a nurse, you're a front door staff, you're anybody in the hospital, you should really give the opportunity to identify patients immediately. So what we do here and what we have been out teaching all across the country is when a patient comes into any facility, ask them first, do you have any symptoms of a respiratory illness? Sneezing, coughing, fever. If so, put on this mask here, please. Clean your hands. Then let's ask you your travel history. And if you've traveled to one of these areas that is of concern, then what you do is you say, okay, let's put you over here for now so you're interacting with other people. We're going to put on gloves and a mask, and we're going to call the right people to come make sure that we can evaluate whether you have COVID-19 or something else of concern. This is our protective equipment that we're using for COVID-19. So when you guys are on the wards, if this is still around, this is what we'll be doing. So a face shield, N95 respirator, isolation gown, and a pair of gloves.
Okay, so this is the epidemics that the WHO has called a public health emergency of international concern, and this was just recently done for this one. And I showed this slide because I love this quote. You can be a Nobel Prize winner, you can be really, really smart, but you can say dumb things. We all say dumb things once in a while. And this guy said, one can think of the middle of the 20th century as one of the most important social revolutions in history. The elimination of infectious disease as a significant factor in social life. Okay? Well, wrong. We didn't eliminate it. And I was hearing that as I was going into ID. I said, oh my God, I mean, this is going to be.
ID doctors love this quote because we were like, ha ha, you're right. We've proven a Nobel laureate wrong. So there's a lot of things out there in the future for us to look at. We're going to improve our diagnostic testing. Hopefully we'll have good antiretrovirals. This is what keeps me up at night. This transmission within our hospitals and our healthcare systems and the impact that could have in our communities. Why it's so important for all of us to teach you guys how to do this, how to help our healthcare systems do this. So we protect all of us and protect our family members. Spectrum of disease, I think we're going to learn a lot. Vaccines, I think we'll learn a lot. And then figuring out where the animal reservoir and why the outbreak occurred. I think we'll see that in the next several weeks.
Little self-promotion. I wrote this paper in JAMA, and I send it around. Feel free to read it. It's really simple, 2 pages. And there's a lot of one thing that's happened in this outbreak that is really cool is journals have created landing sites for this epidemic, specific landing sites, and the really cool is they made all the papers free. So they removed firewalls. This has never happened with an outbreak, that you have that kind of stuff. So again, information, flow of information. Everybody wants to get information to the right people all the time, immediately. And those are really good sites to go. We're members of the Infectious Society of America. The nice thing about IDSA is if you go to the IDSA site, I think it's actually the best, because one thing we did in the IDSA site, and I just messed it up. But if you go to the IDSA site, I recommend this one strongly. If you go to the IDSA site, we have put in the IDSA site a link to all those journals. So you want to go to New England Journal of Medicine, you click in there, and you go to the New England Journal of Medicine site on this disease. But you can have all the information, including podcasts and everything for IDSA is right here. So if you're going to go one place, go to the IDSA coronavirus site. All the information is being put there. Anyway, questions?
Sure. We're here for you. Sorry we took a little longer than we thought, but we're here to answer questions for you guys.
Really quick, I know a bunch of us first-year med students have class at 1. So if any first-year med students or anyone that has to be somewhere at 1 want to ask questions first.
And if you have more questions, tweet us questions. We're happy to answer through Twitter, okay?
And if you both could repeat the question for the live stream on your mics, that'd be great. Thanks.
So first years, what are your questions? Yes.
So you talked about how there wasn't a vaccine for the SARS outbreak, but it seems like there's a really quick turnaround for this NIH vaccine trial. Can you comment a little bit on how that changed or that technology has changed?
Yeah, so the question is how come for the previous outbreaks we had actually no vaccine that were developed, and for this we think we might have some candidates coming soon. So it's really an advancement in technology. So we sequence the virus immediately. We also have nucleic acid-based vaccine technologies that we didn't have 10 years ago.
So the NIH started working on the vaccine. They didn't even have, the Chinese sequenced the virus. They put the viral sequence up in the web, and the people at NIH took those sequences and started working on the vaccine. They didn't even need to have the virus.
Right. So it's the computer modeling and that ability to really engineer things in virtual environments that now allows these vaccines
I
to be
mean,
developed.
think about how vaccinology has advanced. What did Jenner did to produce a vaccine? He took the scabs from somebody, right? And then kind of grinded and injected into somebody else. And that's how vaccinology started. Now we do this technology. I mean, vaccinology has advanced in incredible ways.
Yeah. Great question. Yes.
As far as the number of viral particles that are required for actual transmissions, do you have an idea?
It's a great question. So you're asking, the question is how many viral particles does it take to create this infection or the infectivity of this virus? So we don't know that yet. So most coronaviruses have sort of a moderate infectivity. So it takes it's not 1 or 2 viral particles, but you have to have enough exposure to sort of subvert the mucosal immunity and get through. But we don't have information yet for this virus. Great question. Up front and then. So incubation period is on average 5 to 6 days. It looks like the range maybe 2 to 14 days, but the 95% confidence interval is really between like 4 and 12 days.
But that's why they're keeping people in quarantine for 14 days.
Yep.
So we know that SARS and MERS sort of fizzled out towards the end of time. Do we know that's sort of the same course that
If
You
I
can
knew the
predict
answer,
that
if I knew
for
the
us.
answer, I would be in Las Vegas playing
Yeah,
on the.
exactly. We would love to know about that. So SARS did fizzle out, and it did because of really great public health and infection control. MERS is actually still there. It's just sort of smoldering there. We have a few cases every month, and particularly in certain months where there's a lot of people coming into the Mediterranean.
But you can
Arabian
imagine with
Peninsula.
MERS, every year, because it's still in the Arabian Peninsula, the biggest concern every year is what? The Hajj, right?
Yeah.
Millions of people come, right? And so again, think about a disease spreading that way. The advantage we have at MERS is what? The R naught is less than 1.
Right.
What does that mean? It doesn't have sustained human-to-human transmission. We know diseases have human-to-human transmission, but what you really worry about is the sustained human-to-human transmission. 1 infecting 2, 2 infecting 4, 4 infecting 8. That's what you really worry about. Now, is it going to go? What is it going to happen here? I don't think anybody knows.
It could go on for a while, and that's our fear. Yeah.
You alluded to this a little bit, but when it seems as though quarantine on its own is no longer being effective, what is like the next tool that you're capable of using when you have this large?
So first in an outbreak, you go into protection, right? So social distancing is really important. So keeping sick people in their houses, closing schools, closing restaurants, closing places like the subway, etc. Then you go into quarantine. That's just social distancing, right? Then you go into quarantine, which is what they're doing right now in China. And then you have to go into what's called you go from containment to mitigation phase, which is essentially the phase in which you start taking care of the sick people and trying to prevent the sick from spreading in hospitals. So for example, during 2009 pandemic flu, when I was in Mexico, and there were a lot of people coming to the hospitals, what we were trying to do is prevent the spread. So literally at the entrance of the hospital, you would see somebody, they came in with symptoms of the flu, you gave them a little bag that has oseltamivir, gloves, face mask, and Purell. And they went home. You didn't want them in your waiting room because you didn't want to spread more, right? You were there just telling them, here's what you have, go. And you check their O2 sat, and their O2 sat was normal, you didn't bring them in. So that's the next phase, right? And after that, then you start to getting into the sort of the crisis phase, right? When a lot of sick people come into the hospital. I imagine that's how it's like in China. I mean, again, I haven't confirmed this, but this colleague who's from Wuhan, who works at the Hope Clinic, was telling me there's so many sick people requiring ventilatory support that anybody over the age of 55 is not going on a vent. So when you see the mortality, they're saying most people dying are over the age of 60. Well, yes, because they're getting sicker, and guess what? They're not going to ICUs because the ICU beds are full with younger people. So you start having to make those kind of decisions. And hopefully, we won't get there because hopefully we'll have a vaccine by then. That's why we need the vaccine. Now, what could happen is by the time the vaccine is ready to go into clinical trials, especially into field trials, the disease may have fizzled. but you cannot take the risk of being 6 months from now and saying, hell, where was the vaccine, right? So it's a fast-moving train.
So the question is, how do you figure out the animal intermediates? This is where we very much depend on our epidemiologists who specialize in zoonotic diseases to really do that contact tracing of the original cases and see what they may have come in contact with. Then what they do is they look at the animals in the wild, or if they're farmed animals, look at the animals on the farm, see if they can detect it. But then you have to go back through Cox-Spatulate. You have to actually infect those animals with it and then see if they're transmissible through that. So that sort of process takes several years.
So you
put
guys
all that
know,
data
you guys
together.
heard about the concept One Health? Okay, One Health is this whole issue that we need this interaction between human health, veterinary health, and the environment. There's a disease, for example, called West Nile. How did we discover West Nile? Because crows were dying, right? So again, we are focused on human health. Veterinarians are focused on animal health, but we need to have more interaction. And where we have more interaction is precisely around infectious disease, because that's where we cross between what we do and what they do.
And this also encompasses overall environmental health, and sort of studies in how these interactions occur and the impact to animals, to humans, to the environment altogether. Great question. Yep.
So the Diamond Princess, like, is a cruise ship, so it's not kind of as applicable to real world like transmission rates because everyone's in a closed
Yeah.
But does the kind of situation of so many people have become infected on that ship change how you would kind of approach like asymptomatic kind of spread?
I wouldn't. What I think what has taught me is putting a lot of infected people with uninfected people in the same place in close quarters is not a good idea.
Yeah. So there's professional quarantine, there's planned quarantine, and then there's unplanned quarantine. And this is completely unplanned quarantine.
I mean, I don't know how they did it. I don't know how it was decided, but if I was going to do it, I would have taken all the passengers, I would have tested everybody, and I would have separated the sick people. I would have taken them somewhere else outside the ship, put them in a hospital somewhere, and I would have kept the ship in quarantine, only those uninfected.
Yeah.
But you cannot have them together, even though you say, well, they're in different floors, because the reality is they were letting people go to different floors to exercise and to eat, because, you know, and then you're touching the elevator, and you, again, go back to the movie Contagion.
Yeah. And crew members were moving back and forth. And so it's a really difficult environment.
I mean, there's no way to separate sick from healthy. I mean, who was the biggest concern before this virus? What was the biggest concerns in cruise ship? What's the one thing the cruise ships?
Norovirus.
Norovirus, right?
Exactly.
Because it spreads like this. Think about norovirus.
Other questions? Yeah, so we skipped over that. So I'm glad you asked that question. So the question is, what are the diagnostic tests for coronavirus? There's an RT-PCR assay that was developed in China. It was adapted here in the United States by CDC and is being rolled out to specialty laboratories across the country. So it's a test that takes about 5-6 hours to run, but there's some processing that involves. So all in all, getting the sample to the appropriate laboratory, getting it processed, and then run usually takes about 48 hours to get a result back.
Now, let me tell you one thing. All of you, when you go in the wards, you're going to hear they do on patients a respiratory panel. Yeah. When somebody has an infection, you may think they have influenza. Nowadays, we have these panels that give you a bunch of different viruses in one. They do a PCR for a bunch of things. Among those things that they test for are actually coronaviruses, because remember, I told you coronaviruses cause 10 to 30% of colds. That test, coronavirus, doesn't cover this test, okay? It doesn't pick this up. But trust me, in the emergency room, we've seen at least a couple episodes when they said, oh my God, we got somebody with coronavirus. No, it is the typical coronavirus, the normal test we have in the lab. So if you have somebody like this today, you have to get the state to send your test to CDC. We don't have it in our lab. It's so. Okay. What's the problem right now? Limited test capabilities. Yeah. So there probably is significant underreporting. Yeah.
Yes.
What's the mechanism behind the rapid test? Is that sort of antibody?
So the classic rapid influenza detection test was an antigen detection test. We don't commonly use that in the United States anymore. Our rapid flu test now is a PCR-based test. It's a non-quantitative PCR. So, but yeah, we get an answer back in about an hour in our emergency rooms and our urgent cares with that test. They're trying to use that same platform to create a coronavirus test, but it's still not ready yet. Good question. Yes, sir.
Talk a little bit more about transmission. Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Confused about bodily fluids versus respiratory secretion, droplets.
So back in 2019, if I was seeing Anish, we were running to each other. Hey, Anish, how are you? We don't touch hands, right?
Yeah.
We don't touch hands because we don't want to. I don't know if he washes hands. I don't know if I touched my nose and then I went like this and then, so try to avoid unnecessary touching. And that's a good,
Right. So that's part of the social distancing. So what we know today, so we stand with a posture of caution whenever there's a new outbreak. What we do know about coronaviruses is that they're transmitted by droplets. They're large, as Carlos mentioned, they're large. And so it is not easy to aerosolize them, but it's potentially possible. Therefore, right now we're using airborne precautions in case it gets aerosolized. Well, we do know it's spread by droplets. So within 4 to 6 feet of an individual, they can expectorate their respiratory secretions. We do also know that it can live on surfaces for at least a few hours, if not longer. And so therefore contact. So you can pick it up with your hands and then you touch your mucous membranes, you can expose yourself. So we think droplet and contact are the primary mechanisms. There are other fluids that may have this, such as stool, urine. Whether it's transmissible through those mechanisms is not clear, and probably less efficient, if at all possible, than compared to respiratory secretions.
But look at the movie Contagion. I think they do a really nice job describing this kind of contagious, right?
Yeah.
This kind of, I'm at the elevator, I cough, or I touch my nose, I touch the thing, and then you touch it, and then they get somebody else. So my recommendation to everybody is, have hand sanitizer, wash your hands. As I said, you're never washing your hands too much. Don't touch things that you don't be like touching all the time, stuff, and then be careful about touching your face, and be careful about if you cough, sneeze, do this. Don't do this, right?
And Contagion, as he mentioned, was based off of SARS. So the virus is also very similar to this virus. Yes, sir.
What can we learn from affected individuals who achieve a single recovery?
Oh, beautiful. Talk about the convalescent serum therapy.
Yeah. So what we do when these outbreaks occur, we try to enroll patients in studies so we can understand the physiology, the virology, and the immunology of the virus. And so what we did with Ebola is we took people who had recovered from Ebola, we collected their blood, we found antibodies that were in their plasma, in their serum, and then we actually created a plasma bank so that we could deliver that as a potential therapeutic. So that has been used in lots of different outbreaks. It's actually being done right now in China. So they're phoresing patients, I think also in Singapore. So they're taking antibodies from recovered individuals to see if they would be effective therapeutics. What we do know sort of from immunology is you do your B cells, your memory B cells do mature over time, and the affinity and the avidity of your antibodies get better much later from your recovery. And so probably the early convalescent plasma is probably not all that effective. Once we collect 6 months down the road or a year down the road from them, that might be more effective. But what we have now, up until like 10 years ago, we could only do convalescent plasma. Through some work actually done by Rafi Ahmed here at the Emory Vaccine Center, we've been able to learn how we can clone out those really good antibodies and synthetically create them in mass quantities. And so that is something that will be looked into with this outbreak as well. Other questions? Yes.
Is there a possibility for this virus to go into seasonal circulation like other coronaviruses?
I guess I can say yes, I can say no, I can say maybe. I mean, I think I think what you're realizing is Alan Hidman, who's a very good epidemiologist at WHO, during 2019 said something that I really like. He says, during an outbreak, you wish you knew today what you're going to learn tomorrow. You're always learning stuff, and you say, oh my God, and Ebola was a good example of this. Here at Emory, the decision was made that we were going to cover ourselves and we're going to be using total protective equipment. CDC said, no, there's no need. You only need this, that, and the other. There's not going to be transmission in healthcare setting. Then a patient came to Dallas. Then there was transmission in healthcare settings, and CDC had to say, oops, we have to back off. And actually, Emory was correct. And I wish, wish they hadn't made that mistake. But unfortunately, you're making decisions in public health based on your best available information. And you may make the wrong decision. So I may say right now, no, there's not going to be transmission. And then somebody already blamed me, said, in the paper that I wrote, initially I wrote, there have been no cases of people under 15. And then I toned it down and said, cases of people under the age of 15 have been rare. Now we've seen a bunch of cases. And some people have said, well, how come you said there wasn't? Well, because that's the information I had at that time. For example, some people thought there was perinatal transmission. There's a recent paper saying there isn't. So I think the information is changing continuously. And I think this creates one of the challenges in public health during an outbreak is credibility. How do you keep credibility if you keep contradicting yourself, right? Yesterday, I said there was no transmission in healthcare settings. Now I'm telling you there is. So you need to be very cautious to give information, but not overreach. And I think this is one of the challenges when people say, what's going to happen? If I was able to predict the future, I would be in Las Vegas or somewhere else.
So with 2009 H1N1, there was an epidemic, pandemic, and now it's been a seasonal epidemic again. So that is a possibility. With SARS, as we talked about, it went away. And with MERS-CoV, we sort of have this sort of low-level continuous transmission. So all those things are possible. What we have to do as a public health and healthcare systems is be prepared for all those scenarios. And that's what we talked about sort of in our infection control measures that identify, isolate, and inform. That prepares us for all those possibilities.
So I'm going to end with one thing before we end. Anish said what keeps him up at night is super spreaders and transmission in the hospital. What keeps me up at night is actually that our healthcare systems are saturated. Our hospitals are full. If we had 1,000 people with this in Atlanta, forget about Wuhan, where they have 17,000. If you have 1,000 people like this, we would have no place to put them. There'll be no place in these hospitals in the city to take care of sick people. Our hospitals are working at its limits. I mean, we lost at Grady Hospital during the flood 200 beds, and it created half-lock in the entire city. So one of the challenges that I see that we have as a society is that we have a healthcare system. Actually, we have not built new beds. This city has not built new beds in, 10, 15 years. Because even when Emory built those beds, it wasn't new beds, it was replacement beds. So there's not new beds happening, and there's sick people. And you go and you're going to be rounding in hospitals, you're going to say, oh my God, the ERs are full, everybody. So our hospitals, our healthcare system is not ready to take care of an epidemic. And we also, quite frankly, I don't think we can do what China did. Build a hospital in 10 days. There's no way, I mean, I went to IKEA the other day. They don't sell hospitals. I wish I had. I want to build one for Grady.
I'm going to quote you on that. Thank you guys so much for having us. Appreciate it.